Let's first bring up the incredible director and executive producer, Mr. Ben Stiller. The amazing lead actor and executive producer, Mr. Adam Scott. And one of my favorite composers and a great friend and mentor, Mr. Teddy Shapiro. Good to see you guys. Thank you all for doing this.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start with Ben, with you. I know that you and Teddy have worked together for a while. You've known each other for a while. I'm curious if you could talk about how that collaboration, going back to Tropic Thunder, I think was the first thing, and how that's evolved to now. As a director, yeah, and how that's evolved to now, and how that history impacted this collaboration on Severance.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even. I was just literally saying, was that the first thing we did? But I met you probably through Hamburg, right? Yeah, because John Hamburg had directed Along Came Polly, and that was probably the first time that we connected. And then Dodgeball, which I produced, and that was we'd work on that. So I just think Teddy's incredibly talented. He's so it's ridiculous how talented he is, and he is also a filmmaker. And I think having this long history of making different kinds of movies, mainly comedies together, but then even when we went into doing Tropic, it was trying to give it a different level of a score too that wasn't necessarily a comedy score. And I realized how versatile he is, and how we all get sort of pigeonholed into what you do, especially with comedy. I think Teddy is he has so many different facets. I don't understand how you guys do what you do. Honestly, it's like magic to me that you will go off and have a thought in your head of a tune or whatever, and it's hard enough to even imagine doing that without having to make it match with a picture or figure out how to underscore an emotion. So I'm amazed at what great composers can do, but to have the comfortability we've had over the years, when we got to the point of doing Severance, it felt to me like just a natural thing. And you have these collaborators who you rely on and you trust because you know that they see things the way you see them, or they have their own point of view, and they're going to bring something to it. And on Severance, Teddy wrote most of the music before we even shot a frame of the show, which was incredibly helpful.
Where did that choice come from, and how was that process for you, writing not to picture?
Well, it's something that I really like doing because I just think that it opens you up for happy accidents and things that you maybe wouldn't have come up with if you were sitting in front of the picture, but particularly if you put it in the hands of a great director and a great editor. We have a wonderful collaborator in Jeff Richman. Things will happen that you couldn't have anticipated, and it also lets you write sort of being inspired by the script, by story and character and theme, and sometimes that leads to making unusual choices, bold choices, that you wouldn't be able to see if you were just looking at the picture.
Did you do the same thing for season 2 to write some of the new material?
I wrote a bunch of new material between the seasons.
For episode 204 for the Ortbo, and you wrote. We knew we wanted to have new themes in that episode.
Yeah.
And kind of keying off a little bit of the theremin song that Miss Wong plays, and so that was fun to listen to that stuff before we filmed. And before we filmed season 1 too, we were able to have that music, so that when we started to shoot, we were able to play music on the set for the actors to hear, and which really helped, to get the vibe of MDR. And
Yeah, Adam, what was that like for you? And also being both an executive producer and the lead of the show, how do you feel like your intimate relationship with the psychology of these characters influences your thoughts about how music should function?
Yeah, it was incredible having music that Teddy had already put together when we started in the fall of 2020, started shooting the show, season 1, because the music is incredibly emotional, and it you know, if as a viewer of the show, as a fan of the show, I feel like the music really helps define the show emotionally. It's kind of the welcome mat to the show when it begins every week, but also before, you know, in episode 1 of season 1. And it was like that for us on set as well. Ben would play little bits of what Teddy had come up with when we were starting out, just for like walking down. I remember one of the very first things we shot was me just walking down the hallway. I think it was for episode 3 or 4, and Ben played some of Teddy's music, and it just really set time and place and set the whole thing emotionally for me.
Wow. I'm curious.
That was like Milkshake walking you to the break room, I think.
I believe so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And then watching it now in episode 4, I'm like, oh, I'm doing it all wrong, and I'm just walking down the hall.
I'm curious, going back to you, Adam, when you're thinking about playing the innie and outie versions of Mark, especially in this season, what is that process for you in terms of like your choice to show these very subtle differences between the two? And then what does that look like logistically when it comes to like the episode where you're having a conversation with yourself? How much are you shooting all of the innie Mark stuff together? How much do you want to go back and forth? Are you watching scenes to see how, you know, one spoke and so you can respond in a certain way?
Yeah, I think from the very beginning, it was really important to me and to Ben and to Dan Erickson, the creator, that the innie and outie of Mark feel like the same guy, like not entirely different people or characters, which is sort of the first instinct of any actor. Certainly this one is to like, I want one of them to have a hat and like maybe a mustache, you know. But it was important that they kind of feel like different components of the same person.
That would be funny if like any Mark had to put on a mustache
every
time he
time.
went down.
And a big feather in his hat he puts on. Like, you know, any Mark, outie Mark is like 40 odd years or 50 odd years of life experience, of sorrow and joy and everything that goes into a full life. And any Mark is, for all intents and purposes, 2.5 years old. And so the differences are mostly internal, but those internal differences certainly manifest in subtle physical ways, and it was a matter of just sort of starting from an emotional internal place and seeing where that took us.
I would say we mentioned the, you know, Mark, Innie and Outie Mark talking to each other in the last episode of the season, and it's a 2-character scene, but with one actor, but it's actually, I feel like, a 3-character scene because it's the music is a huge part of that sequence.
100%.
Yeah, and I one of my favorite cues this season of Teddy's is that the cue when Mark when he first opens a camcorder by the fireplace and sees himself, and it just sets the tone. And from there, the beginning of this, you know, 17 or 18 minute scene of, you know, Adam talking to himself, it just pulls you in and then continues to build the tension and is there, and you're not thinking about it, but it's a hugely important part of the scene.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, what I was just going to say is that you know, you have such a great acting moment where you're delighted to see you know, you have this big smile on your face the minute you see your outie, and it really is like this great moment of wonder that I remember sort of being very inspiring to me in terms of how to approach it as a scene, because, you know, you are having this wonderful experience, and then of course it gets contentious, and you know, you know,
Goes downhill pretty
it
fast.
does a little bit, you know, and then from there, you know, my job is just to sort of track that trajectory.
I will say, though, that having a great composer on your side is so incredibly helpful, because if there's a moment or a scene, and it's happened several times throughout Severance, where I'm watching the final cut or a rough cut once there's some music in it, and I'm like, oh, thank God for Teddy, because I was like 40% there, but Teddy's like jumping in and helping me out. it really does make such an incredible difference. It's like another character.
To that end, one of the things that I really found masterful, Teddy, is like how by the end of the season, you're not sure which love relationship to root for. Like, you didn't make one of them overtly, clearly, musically, the one that we're supposed to feel more. I'm curious if you can talk about how you approached, Mark and Gemma and Mark and Heliar in terms of like the love sound for each of them and how that develops to the end of the season, so that when he makes a choice, it feels like so much conflict for the viewer.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, first of all, Mark and Gemma thematically have so much less real estate than Mark and Helly. There are sort of two Mark and Helly themes, and one of them that go on through the season. One of them is a more emotional theme that's really a variation on the main theme, and it's the theme that you hear during their love scene in the office, and it's the one that you hear at the end of the season, and it's the one that really connects most deeply to the emotion of their relationship. And then there's also a second theme that sort of plays. It's really more about the triangle between Mark and Helly and Helena, and that plays. That really plays the uncertainty that season 2 has brought to those characters, and it was an interesting question of what theme I was going to use, in that last moment, and actually, it was temped in by Jeff that the uncertain theme was the one that played over that moment of Mark's decision, and I replaced it with the more emotional one. It's a little bit more of a harbinger of the choice that he's about to make, but I think it coincides with what's happening on his face as he's formulating his decision.
Yeah. So Ben and Adam, I know you guys have to leave. I have one more question. I'm curious about when I was watching this season and seeing that final episode and the violence that occurs. It struck me that it felt earned, and it didn't feel. It's not a violent show, but it felt like it made sense that would happen. Like the tension naturally built to that. I'm curious if you could talk about how you all built to that moment in a way that made it feel like it made sense, even though there was no violence like that before.
Yeah, we thought about that a lot in terms of what is right for the show, what feels right in the show in terms of any kind of violence, or, it's really the idea of the mind control at Lumen in terms of what's keeping everybody down there. We've never had security guards that you want to see, or people that, it's about this sort of like mental state that everybody's in, who's an innie, who doesn't know anything other than what they've been told. So that's that, the idea of the violence, physical violence, comes up very not very often in the show, but there always has to be this feeling of tension that something could happen to them if they did something wrong, or the threat of it, from Grainer in the first season. And I go, Grainer in the first season, that was the first piece of real violence we had. It was when Grainer got killed by Asal. And I thought about that. We talked about that for the end of 210, that there could be another moment like that would go a little bit further. So, very judiciously, of like a moment of real violence that would come up and build to it. And I think the idea in the episode, hopefully, is that the tension is building and building and building. And we had that at the end of season 1, too, the idea of the tension building, and then some sort of a release of it. And within, 210, it was about this scene in the elevator. And it was, we wanted it to be fun, too. We thought, we wanted the, 210 to be, a really fun ride. And in my mind, the end of season 1, the finale is really, fitting for the season, but it's really, if you don't know the show at all, it's just like people walking around and things happen. There's right, you wouldn't know if you didn't know the show. And I wanted this finale to feel like even if you didn't know the show, there's going to be a lot of really cool, fun stuff that will happen that will be unexpected, and that was leading to that moment for sure.
Yeah, while we were making 210, I kept telling Ben, man, this is like our Temple of Doom. This is so fun.
He's obsessed with Indiana Jones.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's my favorite.
Well, I want to say thank you to Ben Stiller and Adam Scott. Thank you guys so much
Thank
for being
you.
here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh man, such a great moment. I'm curious when you see a scene like that, how do you approach spotting it? Like both with Ben and Dan, but also when you're by yourself, how do you plan on kind of spotting all of those different shifts that are happening?
I would say that, with a show like this, a lot of what I'm trying to do is find musical patterns that I can play out in a natural way. So that, as opposed to something that's more Mickey Mousing the action and sort of clinging to each beat, I'm trying to find something that will play the changes and play the moments, but that also can unfold in a way that feels natural and unforced. So in this case, like what it was like finding the tempo, finding the rhythm, and then having this that the chord progression in this cue is really an Irving chord progression that happens throughout the season, and just sort of finding the way to sort of make that serve the picture.
I see. So it sounds like you want the music to be. You should be able to listen to the music by itself, and it sounds like music, and it's not like something that's kind of being forced into the visual.
Yeah, I mean, not because like I want to have a cool soundtrack, but because I think that when it feels unforced and guided by sort of musicality, it just helps it feel less unmanipulative. And so that's sort of what I strive for.
Yeah. To that end, something I was really struck by with this season. I remember watching the first season and being so in love with the main theme and how that kind of exists throughout the show, where the chord progression is like the way it evolves is slightly unexpected. Like it keeps kind of making these turns that you don't really expect, but they kind of feel inevitable. And I remember watching season 2 and talking to my wife about the fact that I feel like you did that to another level where it wasn't the exact same thing and it was taking more turns, but they were still turns that didn't feel like random, but they felt very, very unexpected. I'm curious about you can talk
That's
about
great.
that process.
Yeah, I mean, I had this time between the two seasons, and and so I started thinking about how am I going to take this metaphorical trunk of the tree that I've sort of created in the first season and grow new branches from it. And so, so part of what I was thinking about was like, what could I add on harmonically? Like I've got this 4-chord sequence, how can it go to new places and sort of, play the 4 chords and then it continues to places that it did go in season 1. Melodically, like how can we take the melody of the theme and sort of spin it into new ideas? And timbrally, I worked with a sound designer to sort of come up with new loops and variations, sort of all based on piano. We used the piano and the centrality of the piano to the score, and really dug deep into what sounds can we pull out of the piano. So he sort of made a bunch of loops of him hitting the strings with brushes and hitting the side of the piano and turning those into all sorts of sounds that sound nothing like a piano. So in all those ways we were just trying to build on the language of the first season and take it somewhere new.
When did that relationship with the piano in this show kind of become clear for you? And I wonder if you can talk even about what I just heard in the green room about that sound at the end of the main title.
Yeah. Well, so the big breakthrough with the sound of the show came when I had written something that Ben was responding to, and it had this middle section that had the four chords of the Severance theme, but it was really just kind of a tossed off middle section to a larger suite of music. And I just noticed that Ben was responding to that section of this suite that I'd written. And when I returned, I had visited him in New York and played him this stuff, and when I returned to Los Angeles, I sat down at the piano and played the same four chords, and it immediately took on this new character. It really made it feel connected to 70s cinema, and specifically the great David Shire score to The Conversation. And so I wrote a piece of music that was essentially the main theme, and I sent it to Ben, who didn't respond for 3 weeks, which as I frequently remind him, and then and I was like, oh man, that's a bummer. I thought I was onto something, but I guess he didn't like it. And then he called me one day. He's like, oh, this is amazing. This is great. I really love this. Like, I'm really liking piano and strings and minimalism. And one of the great blessings of working with Ben is just how much I trust him. We were talking earlier about trust in your directors. I just have so much faith in his instincts and his vision, and so we really dove into making piano the core of the sound, stripping back as much as possible, and really letting it be spare. And so at the end of the main title sequence, there's this sort of sound that people, this glitchy sound that people, often ask what it is. And the last piano note of the theme is on an E flat, and so I took an E flat reversed piano sound, or I played an E flat and reversed it. So instead of the sound starting loud and getting softer like a piano does, it starts soft and gets louder. And then as that sound is getting louder, I added distortion to it, and I started manually chopping little tiny bits of audio out of it so that it had that kind of unpredictable, glitchy sound. And then it just really ended up being an important element of the music in the show. And my thought was that it felt like it spoke to the idea of the fraying of the self. And luckily that idea, that concept really ended up being carried over and used in the show as that element.
Yeah, I feel like so much of that glitchiness is something that even makes me think about this season with a lot of the back and forth, and how much of those match cuts feel similarly well suited for that musical choice.
Yes, and I am assisted greatly by the editorial team who does a great job of thinking about that, adding that effect as they're cutting, when they're doing, at the end of season 3 when Adam is on the table and there's that great moment with all those fast cuts. They have added some of those glitching sounds into the track as they're cutting the scene, and it is a composer's best friend. Yeah.
When you were just talking about what you felt like that glitching represented, psychologically, and when I think about the fact that you're writing so much not to picture, I'm curious for you in your process how much you're going deep into thinking about what this show is about or this narrative is on a psychological level, on an emotional level, to pull inspiration from as you're writing.
For the most part, I would say that I'm working intuitively and not, I'm not thinking this is going to be a theme that speaks to this conceptual idea. I would say that once we landed on the main theme, a lot of the work that I did was how can I spin this in a million different directions? What are the things that I can do with this? And then as I said in season 2, how can I expand upon that? We did talk a lot about settings, and like the Ortbo in episode 4, Cobell in Exile in episode 8. We really sort of talked more about sort of finding ways to express the language of Severance, but sort of take it to these new locations.
With that, I think about episode 7 too. I'm curious if you can talk about that, like the Mark and Gemma episode. Like it felt like it looked so different, like it was
Yeah.
treated visually so differently. How did you approach that musically?
Well, so that happens to be one where I didn't pre-write a lot of those ideas. That was one where I really didn't know what it was going to be until I started getting picture. And Jessica Lee Gagne, who directed it, did such a brilliant job, and she's the show's cinematographer, and so as soon as I saw it, just sort of the kaleidoscopic nature of it, I started finding material that sort of spoke to Mark and Gemma's past, and sort of trying to find this kind of sort of well-worn quality, like the piano that I used in that for them was this it's an una corda piano library. Do you know it? Yeah. So like I don't know if you guys know this, most piano, like if you play a single note, it hits 3 strings. And there is such a thing as an una corda piano where instead of hitting 3 strings, each note hits 1 string. And so the sound of it is much more kind of harp-like and delicate. And so I used a sample library that is an una corda piano, and it just has a slightly more delicate quality that I felt like spoke to Mark and Gemma's relationship.
Yeah, it's like a warmth to it
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. This show, there's so much comedy, even though it's like played in this very like straight way, but we find ourselves laughing a lot when we watch it. I'm curious what your conversations were like with Ben and Dan around scoring for comedic moments, scoring for dramatic moments, scoring, as we were talking about earlier, for these moments where there's some sort of like cathartic release of violence. Like, how do you approach the emotional tone when it's kind of jumping back and forth? Do you kind of go with that, or do you try to stay central?
I mean, one of the things that was helpful was in season 1, that kind of 60s jazz palette that, the first time we enter Lumen, we see Mark walking through the halls. I'm doing this kind of Mancini-esque track, and then that's also echoed in some of the song choices throughout season 1. That language kind of helped to inform like a lighter side of Severance that helped with some of the comedy or sort of the lighter beats in season 1. I wouldn't say we talk about it a lot. I would say that I've done a lot of comedy at this point, and I know, I feel like I have a decent sense of like how to manage lightness, even amongst a dramatic scene, and we've just kind of found our way by trusting each other.
One of my favorite moments. Can you talk about writing that, and also did you go to set when they were filming it? Like, what was the process like? Collaborating with the marching band. Yeah, tell us all.
Yeah, so it's an idea that came up during the writer's strike. It's something that didn't exist when we started.
Not from a writer, just to be clear.
What's that? And it was, I mean, as you can imagine, like shooting that scene was just a massive undertaking, and I got to be privy to some of the conversations that Ben was having with costumes, with cinematography, and sort of all of the things that they had to do in order to shoot that scene. They had to, create a set without a ceiling so they could shoot that last shot on from above. Um, you know, Ben wanted all of the band's instruments to be white, which is not that common for a marching band instrument, but they sourced it all. And then they found this great group in New York called Brooklyn United that does this kind of marching band music. And Ben was really he really loves the movie Drumline with Nick Cannon. So he's a big fan. So he was sending me clips from that. And so that kind of set a little bit of a template for kind of the percussion impulse for the music. And then melodically, it was written into the script that it was going to be the Keir hymn, a marching band version of the Keir hymn. And so it was this nice opportunity to kind of superimpose this quasi-religious hymn on top of a very different type of percussion.
How much, I feel like writing for marching band is its own thing with
Yeah.
like all of the different just like the style of playing. I'm curious how much of that was something that you collaborated with them to come up with, and how much of it was like you sent them this arrangement as it is.
So I caught a really lucky break because I know nothing about writing for marching band. But my wonderful assistant, Ethan Harbour, is a percussionist who used to play in a marching band. So I did the arrangement of all of the brass, and I sort of gave him the basic I wanted to sort of be like this, but he arranged the percussion, and he did a brilliant job. Like, all of the detail of the percussion arrangement is his work, and so hats off to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kudos to you too. Yeah. Before I give it to the audience, I'm curious if you can, like, leaving Severance for a second, talk a bit about how you came to be a film composer in the first place. Like, where did that come from for you?
Yeah. So when I was in undergrad, I was composing, but I was doing a lot in theater, both as an actor and as a composer, and like, theater was kind of my world in college, and my friends were people who did theater, and I just knew that I wanted to make music for narrative of some kind, and I loved movies, and so it just felt like the natural fit for me, and I after that I went to a conservatory and got a little bit more into writing concert music, but the thing that I really loved doing was working to picture and collaborating with people, and it's just always been the thing that has drawn me, and I still just really love doing it. Like, I find it interesting every time. I find it interesting that every movie is its own little puzzle that you have to figure out what the elements are going to be, what's the instrumentation, what's the theme, and so it's been a good life's work.
Yeah. I was saying upstairs, I often think about when we first, I think it's when we first met, but I came to visit you and Ludwig at your guys' place, and this is almost 10 years ago. Yeah. And the conversation is something that still plays in my head about, like we were saying upstairs, just this balance between, the job and all of its demands, but also the life aspect of it. And I remember being very inspired by you talking about, that you still want to be there to, like, pick your kids up from school and, like, be a present part of their lives, and kind of setting certain boundaries around your work time. I'm curious if you might be able to talk, especially for any young composers, about, your kind of mindset when it comes to how to balance how much effort you clearly put into your work, but also how much you put into being a human outside of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really something that I'm deeply passionate about, and it was really important to me when we had kids that I was going to be home to have dinner with my family every night, and unless I am deep in the middle of something, I would leave the office at 5:30 every day. and to have time with my family. And there is there's a little bit of like an ethos in the film composing world, and or some parts of the film composing world, that like the job is working around the clock, and that anything else is like not really doing the job. And I just disagree with that. For me, if it works for you, then great. But for me, it was really important to carve out a work-life balance, carve out time for my family, and it makes me so happy that that's something that you have adopted for yourself. And I mean, that means a lot to me.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, for sure. Let's take it to the audience. Maybe you can bring up the lights a little bit. Any questions out there? Yeah, right here.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name's Holly.
Hi.
And I just first want to thank you for being here. From the Secret Life of Old Committee to Severance, like, your music has been with me in times that I'm both inspired, happy, confused. Like, if anybody was going to spoil my life, I hope it was you. Now, that being said, I am not a composer myself, but I am a director, and one of my biggest curiosities is what a composer looks for and how you communicate with your director, what you need out of a director or producers or anybody involved on how to come up with something that everybody's happy with or how to work towards that.
Yeah. So, I would say that for me, the biggest gift that a director can give is an encouragement to fail, like an encouragement to really not be afraid to take a big swing and just totally miss the mark. I think that the best results come when, just when you feel that freedom to be bold, and to not worry about like, oh, is the director going to think I'm crazy, or are they going to hear this and be like, oh, that's not what I had in mind. So that's the biggest thing. And I would really endorse the idea of working with a composer before you start shooting. I think that it really, I have found that some directors really feel like finding the sound before they start shooting really helps them to see what the movie is. And so, if that ends up being something that works for you, I really like that as a way of working. Sure.
With the glasses, right?
Kind of an adjacent question to that. As an editor and a director myself, music and time scores are such a big part of my workflow process. I'm always throwing in music here or there, whatever it may be, whether it's close or completely different from what the final score will sound like. As a composer, I'm curious to hear from you. How does time score fall into your workflow? Do you like it when a director gives you a reference, or do you prefer a clean slate?
Great question. First of all, I mean, many times temp score is a fact of life. That said, mostly it's terrible. I mean, it's not that the temping is terrible, but the replacing it is. And one of the rules that we made on this show was no temp score. That I would do the work to write a ton of music before they started shooting and hand them a library, but like no temp music, nothing that's not original to Severance. And I love that. Like I love that as a way of working, because the thing about temp music is, does everybody know what temp music is? Is everybody clear on that? Okay. You see some notes. Okay. So it is very common after you shoot a movie and you're in the editorial process, because the composer hasn't done the work yet, you take music from other films and you cut it in as a placeholder, and it does help the director communicate to the composer the kind of thing that they're looking for. The problem is everybody gets used to the temp music, and and by the way, like, that's true for the composer as well as the director and the editor. Like, as the composer, even when you are, consciously thinking to yourself, okay, I don't want to do something that's like the temp, like, the back of your brain is like, yeah, but the tempo really kind of works. Um, so so it puts blinders on everybody. So I just think that to the extent that you can get the composer involved and the composer's willing to be involved, I think it's a really great way of working. And for me, it has led to my relationship with the editor on Severance is just so close. Like we would talk every day when we were in production, and it really was like a true collaboration um, between the two of us. So I recommend that.
I'm going to jump in with a question with about the editor. I feel like, especially on TV shows, it's often that we're kind of siloed as composers, where you're not really talking to editorial. I'm curious if that relationship with the editor is something that Dan and Ben facilitated, or that you facilitated. Like, how did that come to be?
I think that I think that Ben facilitated it, and I don't know. I don't think it was a conscious effort. It was like I just remember even before they started shooting the show, he gave me Jeff's number, and I was like, "Here's going to be the rules. I'm going to write you a lot of music, but you can't use any temp." And so I don't think that there was any. I don't think it was like part of some scheme. I think that it just kind of happened through Ben, and it was really fruitful to have that. It is great when you have that kind of back and forth with the editor, and they can say like, "Hey, I've got this thing that you've written, and it's really working great up until this point, and then it's not good anymore. Can you make it work after that?" Like that's a great working relationship.
Yeah, more questions. Yeah, right here.
I'm just a fan and a consumer. I don't have any wonderful questions like those last two. But I am wondering, will you be releasing some of the lovely other music that we've heard in the show with that string version of the theme is so glorious? And will you be releasing?
Oh, thanks. I would love to, um, uh, but it's not my decision. Uh, there are things involved that are above my pay grade. I would love it if that happened. I don't know if it's possible, but like it was so hard with with both seasons, but to to sort of pick what was going to go on the soundtrack and what wasn't. And I know that I left off things that like people would write me on social media and be like, "How could you have left off?" Um, oh, so I forgive you. I forgive you. Um, but anyway, I would love to release more if it's possible.
Tangentially, I'm curious with themes. You were talking earlier about choosing when it's which version of the Mark and Helly theme it was going to be
Yeah.
at the end of at the end of the season. I'm curious how much of that choice of when a theme is used is something that you're doing in collaboration with Ben or Dan, or how much of it's you deciding yourself. Like, I think this should be these themes.
It's mostly me deciding myself. Um, Although, all credit to, all of the many times when Jeff would send me something, the editor, Jeff Richmond, would send me something and he's chosen a theme to cut in, and it's like, yeah, that was really the right thing to do there. And even sometimes, like, there's, um, there's a theme that gets introduced in episode 3 when Cobell is on her way she's driving to Salt's Neck, and then she turns around. And then in episode 8, you get to the scene where she's in her mother's room with the tube, and he cut that theme in there, and it's so amazing. And it's like he took a thing from like way back, and then that's about her journey to this place, and in episode 8 we get to the core of what her pain is surrounding that place, and he's cut that theme in there, and it's so smart. And and so I am ever grateful to having great collaborators who help make the music work.
Yeah, and are listening to those themes to actually know
Yeah.
when to use them. All right, more questions. Yeah, back there, this gentleman here.
Yeah, originally I was going to ask a temp score question, but he did it for me. But it's okay. I have a million other questions. So first of all, I love your music. The first time I heard the show, and just the intro itself, just caught my ear. And ever since, I've been a really huge fan of that score. I think it's
Thank
so
you.
unique and different, and it's just an amazing thing. But my main question was, you used words earlier during the earlier talk about words like kaleidoscopic, fragmented, fraying. There's this notion of not having a center or kind of meandering and not really finding that resolution. And as a somewhat music wonk, I'm always love to hear. This is a question for both of you. Actually, I can't believe we have two composers here. But for me personally, I always wonder, as a wonk, that automatically I think of a certain mode of music. Obviously, only like Korean. But I'm wondering if that comes later. Do you have something in mind, you start playing it, and then you identify, oh, that's what that mode is? Do you come back to that, or is it more of an instinctive feel that you just go with?
It's mostly instinctive for me. Trying to think if I ever think about. I really don't often think about modes. No, I'm really much more thinking about harmonies and chords like that. That's kind of much more where I get oriented. What about you?
Yeah, I think same for me. My background's jazz piano, so I always go to improvising, and I almost like maybe stubbornly, intentionally never learned all the modes, like other than the basic ones, because I just was like, to me, it was just jazz. Like I was just like, I don't want to call it something specific because like there's some things don't really fit into a name in that way. So I usually just improvise and find something, and then it feels right. Yeah, all the way in the back there.
Generally speaking, if so sometimes they have thrown something in, and I am working from that as a template. A lot of the time, I'm just writing from scratch when I'm working to picture. Um, I would say that I'm generally diagnosing the shape of the scene. There's a lot of work in the show where I am, figuring out sort of where momentum happens. Like there's some sort of a rhythmic element that starts here and is going to build to here, or just figuring out what the shape of the storytelling is going to be, and then I write from there. And so there, luckily, the piano being so central to the show is good for me because that's the one instrument that I can play. So I am able to just sit at the piano, and sometimes a cue will be very piano driven, and I'll be able to sort of hack it out as a first step on the way to fleshing it out and making it a fully formed thing.
I have a question to go off of that. When you're writing with a show that has such a clear palette, how often are you seeing a scene and you know that it should be a certain palette, and so you start writing with that instead of the piano? Like, does it always start with the piano, or do you sometimes start with like?
Yeah, no. If I don't use the piano to write if I'm writing strings. Yeah. Do you?
Yeah, I typically do. I mean, I
Yeah.
usually get to like the string patch eventually, but usually it's like starting on piano for the most part. Every now and then, but I'm curious for you. But it seems like you hear like a synth sound or string sounds, you get a different, you respond differently.
Yeah, that's
I'm curious
right.
if
That's
you
right.
feel like the same process. For you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I do. I do a lot of another part of my process is that I work quite a bit with a couple of musicians at the beginning of my writing process, and we do these improvisational sessions where they'll just play freely, and and then I chop those things up, and so like I've got a bunch of violin gestures and a bunch of, so part of the way that I work sometimes is very it's very collage like, where I'll set up, you know, let's say I've got a drone going, and then I can sort of take these, you know, these violin parts and start laying them over the scene, and sort of building music that way, which I find to be a really fun way to work.
Yes, right here.
I want to ask about the show is very deliberate with like its needle drops about songs that previously known, people just know specifically about Billie Holiday. I want to know kind of how early on in the production those songs were cemented, and because those songs carry like such a defined relationship and theme with them, how you go about exploring all the rest of the music that you have to fill with these shows that inform these relationships. How much of that you inspire and you try to like stay away from them so that it can come naturally, or just what your process is kind of writing around those songs?
A lot of times, I think it really varies. It really, really varies. Sometimes they're trying a bunch of different songs, and I don't know what it's going to be in, you know, until later down the road. Sometimes they've landed on the thing, you know, it's written into the script, and so it's very clear what it's going to be. But you know, for the most part, I just try to work with editorial to, you know, to make sure that the music is flowing in and out of those songs. Like we, you know, I think I do a lot of work. Like if there's going to be a song, you know, in MDR, and the music is going to move into it, like I'm pretty deliberate about making sure that the key and the tempo are the same, so that it feels like one can just flow into the other, without it sort of feeling like an abrupt shift. Yeah.
All right, we have time for one more question over there, right there.
Teddy and Kris, you're two of my biggest inspirations. I'm also a composer, so it's amazing having you guys here. Teddy, I wanted to ask you, the whole idea of no tempo is really fascinating to me, and how you compose so much before scoring. And I just want to know, I want to know more about it in terms of like when you saw the picture for the first time after it was shot. How many more beats did you write? How much more did you?
Oh, so much more. So much more. No, I mean, you know, so like, for example, like 210, the finale of season 2 was, I think the episode is 76 minutes long. There's probably 72 to 73 minutes of score. All of it written to picture. Like that was one. Maybe there's one cue that came from a pre-written suite, but almost all of it was written to picture, because there was no way to do it other than to start at the beginning and work my way through. So yeah, no, there's a lot of work is happening to picture after it's been shot.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Teddy.
Thank you, Kris.
Yeah, of course. I just want to say congrats on the Emmy nominations.
Thank you.
Incredibly deserved. The show has 27 nominations. Best Drama Series, Outstanding Director, Outstanding Lead Actor, and Outstanding Score. And I understand we're going to have a little treat here. You're going to play for us.
Little treat.
Yeah, what are you going to play? Can you talk a little bit about it before? What are you going to play?
Oh. I'm going to play the theme to the show Severance.